Everybody, welcome to Unit 3. Now that you're halfway through the class, it's time to get to a section of the course I call When It Matters Most. We're kind of looking at the kinds of scenarios and situations where things can be particularly heightened or when it becomes particularly important and relevant for sporting events to matter or competitions to matter politically more than they might at other times. And we're going to start with this concept of colonial and neo-colonial ties. Colonial ties might be something you're familiar with, the idea that there were colonies in the world where a situation existed where one country dominated from sort of a central hub other countries around the world, which are now countries but were then colonies. So politics, economics, culture, etc., controlled sort of from the center. And when you have the decolonization process and those states sort of broke free, that you have sort of a relationship that exists in perpetuity where those former colonies have some sort of, say, charged relationship with the former masters. Neocolonial might not make as much sense, but it has some of the same sorts of connections. It's where you didn't have direct political control, but you certainly had some exertion of political influence, economic influence, cultural influence that's maybe more one-sided than it might otherwise be. So it doesn't mean there was direct political control, but there's been sort of neo-colonial control where some sort of significant portion of society has been controlled. So we'll look at some of those here and how those play into to sport. So here's a picture of the colonized world in 1945. It's not the colonized world ever, meaning in the 20th century there were much bigger colonial empires than are just listed here. And certainly if you go back into the 19th century, right, you don't see the Spanish Empire on here, for example, because they didn't exist by the time we got to the 20th century. But those relationships still exist. If you tracked where the Spain color of the sort of the gold, which did have this one place left, sort of there, what's now Western Sahara, you'd have much of the Americas that would also be that color. You also don't have, for example, all of the United Kingdom former possessions on here. Canada's not on here. South Africa's not on here. Australia's not on here as being a colony in 1945. This is just 1945, and the countries, the 7 countries down the left-hand side that still had colonies as of 1945. Some of them are still in existence today. But after 1945, you had a process by which the remaining colonies in the world, the majority of the remaining colonies in the world, became independent. And these means that a lot of the post-colonial relationships are relatively recent. That you had you have countries that really became independent starting in 1957 with Ghana, which you mentioned at the end of the last unit, and then Africa really becoming independent after that all the way through into the 1990s. And so you may have had only 4 independent African countries in 1945, but now if you look at the number of membership in the CAF, right, the Confederation of African Football, that we looked at before, that big sporting bingo, there's more than 50 independent members now, from 4 to more than 50. That process took place following 1945, and it leads to some very interesting sporting encounters. For example, Senegal is one of the former colonies of France. So it is a colony located on the western coast of Africa, and there's not a lot where you could say that Senegal has the chance to either directly encounter France on a global stage, or to certainly not to defeat or to come out ahead of France on a global stage. And well, the opening game of World Cup 2002 provided one of these opportunities, and it becomes a very charged matchup for the Senegalese in particular, because not only are they in the World Cup for the first time in 2002, and not only were they playing France in 2002, they were doing so in the opening game of the World Cup. France at that time was the defending World Cup champion. They had won the 1998 competition. The honor of opening the next competition falls either to the host or to the defending champion. It fell to them in this case, and they play Senegal. So Senegal has this chance not just to encounter France, but to do it on this global stage where you have the majority of the world's population, sporting population certainly, but casual attention being paid to this conflict, to this game that's being played. And when Senegal wins, it's a very much bigger deal than if Senegal had defeated the United States. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't have been happy to beat the United States, but the colonial relationship makes it even bigger. And you have these interesting situations where, because the largest population of Senegalese living outside of Senegal live in France, that you actually had thousands and thousands of people coming out of the streets of France to celebrate this victory. They're in France celebrating France losing because they're an expatriate community. And we'll look later in Unit 4 about sort of the persistence of interest of expatriates in their home of origin teams and what it means. But this colonial relationship plays out. And so if we go back that one slide, you'll see these different color combos. And again, we could add some if we expanded Spain and Portugal's around the rest of the world. It means there's lots of these that happen. And for a lot of them, they're not old relations. Like the United States, formerly a colony of the UK, that was more than 200 years ago. Some of them are, less than 50 years still. How about neocolonial relationships? So there's a couple of ways to look at this. So the first one we'll look at is this goofy looking map here on the top right. This is one where you're looking at the distribution of wealth, where the money is. And so they've redrawn the borders to emphasize larger borders if you control more of the global wealth. And you'll see then a lot of the smaller shares of the wealth are in the what we call the global south. That means that a country like the United States, which certainly was on the other colonial map, but the colonies in 1945 were places like Hawaii and Alaska because they hadn't had a chance to decide what they wanted to be yet. They hadn't decided yet to become states. In this case, you're talking about our relationship is very, very strong here vis-a-vis the global south. So what you're looking at is places where we have had dominance, not direct political control, right, over the Americas, but lots of economic control and political influence where we can make or break regimes, where we can help topple regimes. And we did some of this stuff in the 19th and 20th centuries. And what that leaves is a 21st century reality where there's some harsh feelings about that neocolonial relationship, which then can be transformed onto the playing field in interesting ways. That's why when in Unit 2, when those couple of examples of peculiar nationalism in sport, when you had that outpouring of love and appreciation for the United States from Mexico and from Honduras, when that long neocolonial relationship stood, usually the sporting relationship is one where it's their chance to really win in a different way against the United States when they don't usually have equal power in, say, in trade negotiations or military negotiations, etc. So it's a big deal for them. The other one then here would be where you had either direct political control because it wasn't so much a colony as a country that broke up, or significant political influence. And so the Soviet Union is one great example there, where you had the 15 states of the SSR, right? The USSR stood for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So an SSR was a Soviet Socialist Republic, the equivalent of a state. There were 15 of these. It splits up in the 1990s. So you go from having one USSR to 15 former SSRs, or Russia plus 14, and Russia sort of inherits that mantle of the main power. And so those relationships play out differently. When you look, say, here at the former Soviet bloc, you had both the countries that were in the SSR and then countries that were influenced by the Soviets. They were in the Soviet sphere of influence during the Cold War. So Ukraine was an SSR, and Ukraine's still in the news with its relationship with Russia. It's a very complicated relationship, but it does mean that when they play sports, there's a chance for additional care. And in this final race, this is from the 2011 track and field championships, where the Ukrainian women took bronze in a race where the Russians were shut out of the medals. Becomes a bigger deal than if the Russians hadn't been in the race. Lithuania also had been an SSR in basketball, and the Soviet Union in basketball, and Russia and Lithuania is a very big deal. But even this other one here, this is a picture on the left of the last playoff game to get into the 2010 World Cup. It came down to Russia versus Slovenia. Slovenia was not an SSR, but it was part of Yugoslavia, which was part of the Soviet bloc. And so that political sort of neocolonial relationship reigns. And we could do Yugoslav states as well, the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, and how these colonial and neocolonial relationships work out. All of these things mean that through the colonial and neocolonial relationships, that sports can tend to be even more charged than they otherwise might have been. So, does that mean it's always problematic or always bad? Is there a positive side is the question. And the answer is yes, there is a positive side, and we're going to look at that here in a minute, because what they're going to try and do in some situations is use sport to be a unifying cultural factor. The question has been long, particularly in the former colonial relationship, is what's the responsibility of the former colonial master to that former colony? Should they have some sort of privileged trade deals? Should they have some sort of exchange of scientists? Should they give technology transfers? What should be going on there? And that's not always an easy thing to answer, but one of the things they're going to try and do is find a place for that. We looked in Unit 2 about safe aggression. What about safe cooperation? Can you cooperate in a way that doesn't seem to be dominant? Because one of the things you want to be careful with in a colonial or neocolonial situation, or post-colonial or post-neocolonial situation, is it's not, say, the savior from the north, the savior from the west, the savior from the former colony going in and helping out the poor, underdeveloped person, but to have them be an equal in some sort of way. And that's where these games come in. So let's start with the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is a cultural organization dedicated to states that were formerly part of the British Empire. Again, it's not all the former parts of the British Empire, right? That's why you don't see the United States on here, for example. But it's one where there's some sort of cooperation in terms of of their relationships. It's designed to promote commonality and unity in culture, trade, etc. And one of the things they do then is turn to sports. So there were these things starting in 1966 called the British Empire Games, or the British Empire and Commonwealth Games. So they were designed to be things that were still in the empire before it started to break up. When it started to break up, you could break up and then still have that affiliation back to the Commonwealth. So there's the British Empire plus the Commonwealth. And then now in the modern era, there is no British Empire anymore. It's just the Commonwealth. So they may still have some colonies. You can send me an email and ask about what the colonies may still be if you want. But by and large, the colonies are gone. There's a Commonwealth, this relationship. And usually what it means is that you go to one of the main hubs of the former empire. You may go to Australia, you may go to you may go to Scotland, you may go somewhere else to have the Commonwealth Games. It can also mean that some of the smaller former entities host, and it can mean a big deal. So in 1966, Jamaica was a brand new independent country when they hosted the British Empire and Commonwealth Games. And it was a big deal for Jamaica to host, as it was for Malaysia to host in 1998 or India in 2010. Similar to the Commonwealth Games are the games of the Francophone world. So the Francophone world is this loose affiliation, same sort of thing, of former French colonies. And you'll see if we go back up there, keep an eye on Canada there in the on the left-hand side, and you'll see Canada is blue there and Canada is red there. That's because some of the places in the world were part of both empires at one time or another. So Canada is one of the handful of places that's in both the Commonwealth and the Francophone Organization of the Francophonie. And for not as many years as they've been having Commonwealth Games, they've been having Francophone Games, the Jeux of the Commonwealth Games. And they play these all over the place. They can be hosted in Ottawa, but they can also be hosted in Beirut, in Lebanon. They can be hosted all over the place, and a chance for some of these states to come to the fore and host and try and get that positive sort of collaboration to the fore. Additional sporting events, yes, they do exist. The Lusophony Games are former Portuguese Empire Games. Then you have regional games, Asian Games, Pan Am Games, African Games, European Games. The European Games are brand new. Their first iteration was in 2015. It's trying to do some of these regional unity sorts of things that exist other places as well. So the idea with all of these is that you're going to try and have that positive aspect to this situation. Situation where it can matter more sometimes than others because of former colonial or former neocolonial or active neocolonial relationships. So the extent of those expand the number of charged matchups you can have. Charged matchups mean that populations and the politicians and others are paying more attention than they otherwise might. And it does also mean, though, that there is going to be an attempt to have a unifying effect, if possible, but how that plays out depends a lot on situation, context, and how things are going in those countries at the given time. Anyway, we're into this idea of sports mattering most, and we'll continue to look at that as we go through Unit 3.